So good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Holy Thursday. It's the beginning of the Triduum, the 3 days that bring the whole of the Passion story, and indeed the whole of the last 40 days of liturgical preparation and personal ascesis or personal reflection. It's these 3 days that sort of like a wave that catches it all up and brings us into the deep mystery of the resurrection, which is without which we wouldn't be here, without which there would be no Christian faith. As St. Paul said, if that is an illusion, then we're in a mess. There is nothing, actually. So we circle in, we come into a reflection and an encounter with the mystery of the resurrection, always in a community of faith. And every year there is this, every day, every meditation, this is what we're doing. John Main says every time we meditate, we enter into the dying and the rising of Christ. So if we meditate in Christian faith, we are living out this paschal mystery, this passion story, in our own experience, in Him, with Him, through Him. But these annual liturgical moments give us the time to focus both intellectually, poetically, communally, religiously through the rituals, and spiritually on the meaning. So we've been looking the last couple of days at an aspect of the story which opens the story and, as it were, drives it, which is this experience, this aspect of betrayal. And it's not an easy topic to explore because it very quickly makes us realize that we are not only the victims of betrayal, but we ourselves betray. This is inherent in our human weakness and in our human learning, our human development. We go through this, perhaps with every separation, every stage of our human development from infancy on, we go through this experience. John Main once said the whole purpose of Christian education is to prepare us to deal with this experience of betrayal and to understand it. Anyway, I think we've said enough about betrayal to cheer us up. But now I think we go into the story, and with that awareness, with that aspect highlighted for us, because it should be, it's there. And now we begin to see how it works and what is healed in the human condition, what is corrected, what is exposed to the light. So wherever there is betrayal, there is a sense of sin, a sense of failure, and inevitably a sense of shame or of guilt. But this betrayal, we should remember, and we remember it this evening at the Mass of the Lord's Supper, this shame or this sin of betrayal is exposed and faced in the context of a meal with friends. It's not dealt with in terms of a judicial review or of a punishment. Jesus, like God, does not punish. So it's dealt with, it's faced, confronted and understood within the context of friendship. And a meal with friends, as I hope you've been enjoying these last few days, is a celebration of friendship. It's a celebration of our mortality, our earthiness, our need for food, our enjoyment of food and drink, and a very basic human need, perhaps the most basic. And it's a celebration of this basic appetite we have for life, the need for sustenance, physical, but also our second most basic need, our need for relationship, our need for friendship, our need for intimacy and trust and affection. So, as we know, children, babies who are given sustenance, the right kind of food and drink and shelter, but are deprived of affection and cuddles and hugs and oohings and ahhings, those children don't physically even develop as well as those who do receive that kind of human touch and affection. So I think in the Last Supper, we celebrate in the Eucharist, we have a great teaching, a great symbol and a great gift that brings together both the sustenance that we need and the friendship, the community that we need in order to come to the fullness of our humanity, to come to growth. So it's in this context, maybe surprisingly, that we are invited to reflect upon the meaning of human sin and our sense of failure, our sense of shame that gets into, to some degree, all human relationships. What gives us the confidence or the reassurance or the security to do that? It could only be that this meal that we're sharing with Jesus is a meal that expresses his, not only his understanding, but his way of dealing with this problem of betrayal. And he deals with it, as we've seen, not by rebuking or punishing or blaming or even being hurt and sulking, but he deals with it by accepting it so totally that it transforms it. This is forgiveness in its deepest understanding. If we think of forgiveness simply as kind of being let off, okay, we've been found guilty, we've been caught speeding, or we've been caught doing something wrong, or telling a lie, all the things we would not like to be caught out doing. But then we get a nice policeman. And he says, okay, don't worry, next time, do it next time. He says, oh, thank God, he forgave me. But that isn't really what forgiveness means, not as we're going to explore it in this story the next 3 days. Forgiveness is much more than just being let off or reprieved, which still keeps us in the same cycle. We're still trapped in that. And we will repeat it, or it will be repeated in us. But forgiveness, as it is revealed in the teaching of Jesus and in the way he deals with these issues, his teaching and his action are consistent. In the way he deals with it, we see that the forgiveness actually changes the chemistry. This experience of acceptance as we are changes us, frees us or breaks us out of this cycle of self-reinforcing failure. So there's a reassurance when we have a meal with friends who we trust and enjoy the company of. We celebrate the gift of friendship. We enjoy these people. We feel reassured that they are in our lives. And we are also experiencing a healing, such as we don't get in a fast food restaurant. There isn't that ritual. Fast food, going to get getting McDonald's, fish and chips is all right. That is good. That is okay. But to get a McDonald's is putting food into our bellies, food that is not good for us anyway and addictive, of course. But there isn't that ritual, or very little of it. It's really reduced to a commercial exchange and finding a place to sit or eating it in the car. So, but a meal has a ritual quality to it, even in a restaurant. There's this ritual, formal relationship with the waiter or the waitress, which is, they're like servers at the Mass, in a sense. There's in America, of course, within 5 minutes you know everything about the waiter, their personal life, and they expect you to tell them everything too about your personal life. But normally there is this ceremonial aspect, this ritual aspect, and although culturally we're not very comfortable with ritual, or as much as we were, if you don't have a monarchy, perhaps it's a little more difficult. But anyway, so in a meal there is this ritual dimension which allows a healing to take place. It expresses, you need a certain impersonality or a certain formality or a certain predictability in what you're doing, in the actions, for this message or this experience to be transmitted. And that's really what a sacrament is. You can play around with the details. You don't have to become obsessive about every detail of the ritual. That would also be to deny the humanity of it. But on the other hand, there's a limit to what you can change. I mean, if you went into a restaurant and it's like even when you ask for the bill and you can't get the waiter's attention, it's really breaking the ritual if you stand up and go and find the waiter, isn't it? It shows your impatience, which is what I usually do, because I'm impatient. But I realize if I do that it is it's not playing by the rules, really. So there are rules. Sacramental rituals have these rules, and if we don't respect them, you can play around with them a little bit, as I said. But if you don't respect the basic formula, then you lose some of this capacity to communicate the deeper grace or the deeper gift and effects of what you're doing with others. So I think in this sacrament of the Eucharist, which has developed from the Last Supper that we celebrate this evening, we see a transformative power. I think Carl Jung wrote an essay on the Eucharist as symbols of transformation. And we don't often think of it like that, particularly today, unless I think we come to it from a deeper contemplative position. And for many people, this ritual is empty and meaningless because it doesn't connect with us, because it doesn't seem to be about transformation. It seems to be much more about just repetition of some kind of habit or social signal, this is who we are. And we are Episcopalians, or we're Catholics, or we're Church of Christ, or whatever we are. So it tends to be seen as a self-reinforcing social identity rather than this experience of transformation. Now, of course, it does also nurture the identity of the group that's celebrating it. But it becomes a closed system, closed in on itself and on its own membership, unless there is this experience of the transformative power of what you're doing in this ritual. And that, I think, is what meditation helps us to do. It brings us back to these sacramental mysteries, these sacramental rituals, with a new sense, and it is a spiritual sense, a new sense of their meaning and value. Even if on the outside it seems like the same old thing and it doesn't excite you, it isn't the most beautiful liturgy or the most beautiful music, or there's aspects of it that trigger unhappy memories in you, sitting in the pew as a child and so on. There can still be these accidents in the form of the Mass, the Eucharist, communion service, whatever it is. And yet, despite that, and beyond that, and I remember meeting a woman some years ago who was in a meditation group, and I was giving a talk in a cathedral, and I was talking with her afterwards, and she said she'd stopped going to church because she felt so unhappy with the way women were treated, and she just couldn't do it, and she was starting to meditate, and a couple of years later or so I met her again, and she just remarked that she had started to go to Mass again. It hadn't changed her mind and her sense of anger about the way women were treated in the church, but she could see beyond that, or she felt beyond that. And she said, the meditation has reawakened in me a sense of what it's actually about, what the Mass is about. And I don't want to be deprived of it, even though it still annoys me when the priest says this or assumes that. So you can, I think it does, meditation, as John Main said actually in his little book, The Christian Mysteries, does help to reawaken and refresh the meaning of the sacraments and the symbolism. So what's at the heart of this experience of transformation, of celebration, and mystery that we enter into in a sacrament and in the Eucharist in particular? Well, I think in the simplest sense it is the experience of God. Meditation changes our image of God. It will, because in teaching us to lay aside all images of God when we meditate, all ideas, all dialogue with God, and to enter into silence, it's inevitable that we will take a little distance from or be detached from even the most powerful images. It doesn't mean to say that after the meditation we don't pick up those images again, or those symbols, or those statements about God, but we do so in a symbolic way. We realize these are not literal statements. Even if we say, God wants something, I mean, that's a huge presumption on our part. First of all, to think that God wants, because we can only think of wanting in terms of human wanting, human desire, and even to say specifically what God wants is rather presumptuous. So I think meditation, by taking us into on the other side of the island, the apophatic side, where we let go of images and words about God and words to God, these words and symbols are refreshed. And if you come to meditation without any image of God, and that can happen, most people have some kind of social residue of an idea about God. That's why people, atheists will often say to you, of course, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in your God, even without asking what your God is or what you may believe. So they assume that there's this residual social image of God as a kind of operator, supreme CEO or chief operating officer outside of this world, but looking down on it and playing with us or whatever. So even if you came to meditation without any image of God, I think you would certainly enter into an experience of God. If you do it, if you put yourself into this, or allow yourself to be led into this silence, and make this simple journey from the mind to the heart, you will begin to experience reality and to experience God in a new way. That experience will then seek understanding. It will seek some form of expression, because that's human beings, we need to express and understand what we experience. So it varies what direction you approach this experience of God from. But one thing that meditation, for example, will teach us is that we do not experience God as another being or a being, even an infinite being. The very language here betrays the truth, or betrays the falsehood in that image of God as a being alongside, or maybe even above, all other beings. That image of God would be a false God, a God who does not exist, in fact. That's what a false God is. A false God is one that actually doesn't exist, except in our imagination, or as a projection of our needs, or anxiety, or fantasies, or the ego. So, and this is the perennial tension between the apophatic and the cataphatic, between the experience in itself and the language and the symbols by which we try to express and understand the experience and communicate it. Even Jesus would have had this tension. Jesus speaks about the Father, for example, and in the language that he uses, the language of the parables above all, he chooses very simple language and imagery to try to communicate this. Symbols, parables, images that anyone can relate to at a certain level, and that we can go back to over and over again and find that these same stories, the same language, the words of Jesus, take us to another level. So this was his genius and his style as a teacher, that he used very simple language drawn from ordinary life, the parables of growth, of daily interactions, and even his word for God, Abba, Father, is a word that expresses a certain. It's like dad. It's a familiar, intimate term to describe the Father, or the fatherhood of God. So even that challenges us. Saint Philip, one of the disciples, said to Jesus when he was talking about the Father, "Lord, show us the Father, and it will be enough." And Jesus replies, in John, Jesus replies, "You still haven't quite understood yet that to see me is to see the Father. Because, as he says later, the Father and I are one." Well, there's an inherent paradox in that. The Father and I are one. This is a statement of universal non-duality. It's the Advaita of Indian philosophy, but indeed of all mystical wisdom, that it is not one and it is not two. Advaita, non-duality. The Father and I, two, are actually one. So why do we say the Father and I? They're not one, not two. So it is paradox and simplicity that enables us, as far as we can, to communicate and understand the experience of God that we enter into in meditation. And if we have this opportunity, if we have this capacity, if we have this app installed in our minds, in the rituals, in the sacraments, and in the Mass, for example. If we don't have this app of sacramental sensitivity or capacity, then we just look on this ritual as meaningless and empty. But if you've got something loaded in you, I think meditation loads it. If you've got this something that enables you to relate and connect to the symbols and to the ritual, then the experience of God opens for you and takes you further through the sacrament, through the ritual itself. Now, having said all that, that isn't often how the Mass, the Eucharist, is seen or described, and it isn't people's usually their first sense of what it's about. As I said, very often it seems to be a rather cold, mechanical, repetitive, socially reinforcing ritual. But even so, as that woman in the cathedral realized, even if it isn't celebrated with a full understanding or sensitivity to what it is, nevertheless, it still has a power, a grace, to lead us into this deeper experience of God. But if we can understand the Mass as this ritual arising out of the Last Supper, in the course of which Jesus addresses and faces the most painful and shameful aspect of human relationships, which is betrayal, then we can begin to see that the Mass is actually a healing ritual. And isn't that what Jesus was doing at the Last Supper? And in the early church, this was actually how it was seen. It only became a legal kind of ceremony which you had to attend. And if, even when I was growing up, not to go to Mass on Sunday was a mortal sin, which meant, I don't know how many people believed it, but enough people half believed it, and some people really believed it literally, and they were the real victims of this, that if you didn't go to Mass on Sunday through your own fault, and that was a whole lot of stuff you could play around with, then you were in a state of mortal sin, which meant that if you died without having had that mortal sin removed, forget it. You were down there in the sulfur and the burning fires of hell for the rest of eternity. How many of you remember that sort of? Oh my God. Okay. So it was very powerful. You look back on it now. It was sort of everyone was complicit in it in a way. People didn't know what they were saying, but it's a kind of abuse, actually, to put that fear into people, especially concerning something that actually has completely the opposite effect. To going to Mass, for example, is a healing through acceptance of our sin. It's not a rebuke, it's not a punishment, and we should always remember Jesus gave himself, even in the bread, the one I dip this bread, the one to whom I give this piece of bread that I dipped into the dish, he gave that to those he knew were going to betray him. So, I think it's very important for us today and tonight to reflect on the meaning of the Mass, because that is the key to understanding Good Friday and the crucifixion. And they are essentially the same sacrifice. We must come back to this word sacrifice in a minute, because it can lead us astray. So in the Mass then we should be prepared for an experience of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of healing. These are all aspects of our experience of God. We can't have an experience of God that does not involve forgiveness, reconciliation, or healing. If we have what we think is an experience of God and we come away feeling accused or guilty, or even if we come away feeling, well, thank God I got away with that, I would say the experience of God was quite likely to be a false God, a God that does not exist. Now, The Cloud of Unknowing, this little book on Christian meditation written in the 14th century, has an interesting phrase when it says that it dries up the root of sin within you, which is quite a controversial statement in the 14th century, when so much emphasis was given on sacramental confession and the absolution given by the priest, which was the only thing that would get you off the hook. So to speak about contemplation as actually getting to the root of sin within us and solving the problem, as it were, from within, healing it from within, was quite a leap. It's interesting that it's the great mystics who understand sin best. And The Cloud of Unknowing actually says, sinners make the best contemplatives. That's quite similar to what Jesus is saying when he invites, the dregs of society to the high table, to the best table. Sinners make the best contemplatives. I often put it the other way around: contemplatives make the best sinners, and which is no doubt also true. So. Mother Julian of Norwich, in the same way, has a theology of sin that, based on her mystical contemplative experience, which is strikes you as true, even though it is disturbing to some people. Actually, the introduction, I think it's to the Penguin edition of Julian of Norwich's book, Revelations of Divine Love, is very annoyed with her theology of sin and tries to sort of dismiss it. I don't know if it's the same introduction, but some years ago it was. So it's quite disturbing to the theological assumptions we may have inherited about sin and our experience of God and so on, when the great mystics get to the very heart of the meaning of the gospel and what the experience of God actually means. So, the right, or the true, or the good way of celebrating the Mass teaches us, reminds us of what the early Church understood as Christ not as a judge, or as a policeman, or as a law enforcer, but Christ as the divine physician. And they used, as Jesus himself did, the image of healing, of medicine, rather than the image of condemnation and imprisonment and punishment and sentencing. What's strange and interesting is how this fundamental metaphor of the sacrament of Christ And the sacraments by which we enter into a deeper knowledge of Christ is about healing the human condition, not judging it. Something, we went into a big drift for all sorts of pragmatic reasons, perhaps. So, to see the Mass, in other words, then, as a ritual, a sacrament of healing. So what about the sacrament of penance, going to confession, which for many Catholics especially became a very important and sometimes a very disturbing habit or ritual or sense of obligation. You were a good Catholic if you went to confession every Saturday before Mass. Religious and priests were supposed to go to confession. Even, I mean, I met some old religious who used to, felt they had to go to confession every day, which was pushing it a bit. So, the development of the sacrament of penance gives us a sense of how we lost this metaphor of medicine and ended up with this metaphor of the law, or legality, and so on. Confession, I mean, the early church had this sense that we do need rituals of reconciliation and of forgiveness, and an element of penance as an expression of our contrition was healthy. Maybe you had to go on a pilgrimage, or maybe you had to, I don't know, make up, give some money away, or whatever the gesture, the symbolic gesture would be. That would be your penance. But it wasn't seen so much as a punishment, or rather as a sign of, first of all, contrition, that you saw that you had maybe had done something wrong, or you were acting under some illusion or compulsion, which you now accept to be wrong, and you want to make it better. So contrition, and then confession. The healing aspect of speaking about things. We do that today with therapists. It's the same thing. It's the same psychological dynamic. To have someone, or maybe a therapy group. Groups are very effective today, again. And some years ago, when they had this general absolution ritual, where the parishioners would come to the church in the middle of the week for a penance service, fantastically popular. People flocked more. They came to the penance service rather than to Mass, because they were expressing. It was touching a deep need, and the official rule was that there would be an absolution, because in the Catholic mind you need this absolution to make it okay, to sort of sign away your release. But you would get a sort of a conditional absolution, and it was conditional upon, I think, going to private confession to a priest, one-to-one, within a week or a month, or I don't know how long. So I don't know how many people did that, and I suspect they didn't need it. They felt that they had this absolution, and maybe this was just a little formality, that maybe if they were a little more scrupulous and rule-oriented they would, but and maybe it was beneficial to them. I'm not making too many sweeping generalizations about this, because people's needs are different. But that was very popular and very obviously helpful to people. But anyway, that because it threatened the priority of the individual personal confession, which was already in huge decline, the general absolution ritual was abolished. strange phenomenon, really, of not recognizing where the Spirit of God was moving in people. But anyway, we might, what Jesus might have said was putting human rules above the law of God, in a sense. But in any case, these are the elements of a healing ritual, as expressed in the way that the sacrament of penance developed over the centuries. It was about the I think between the 4th and the 6th centuries that the idea of personal confession began. The Celtic monastic church helped to develop that idea of personal confession through the relationship with soul friends within the community. So it wasn't sort of just going to an ordained minister, and in fact there have been cases of non-ordained, and even of, I think Hildegard of Bingen even was given the right or the power to give absolution. So there were variations in this that we should sort of remember. But by the 13th, and then between the 13th and the 16th century, the Lateran Council and the Council of Trent, the familiar format of confession, as most Catholics came to understand it, was established and regulated very strictly. You had to go to confession once a year to your parish priest. And if you didn't, you were in a state of mortal sin. That was a new rule. So this was really the Church saying, we are instituting a new man-made rule that has power over your eternal salvation or damnation. Quite a big claim to make, but it was made in Italy, so how many people in Italy, for example, actually believed it, maybe is another matter. But so this was the format of our laundry list of offences that we would go into the confessional on a Saturday evening, or when you'd done something you felt very guilty about, quite often a sexual sin, then you would feel better after you had gone through this ritual. But did it dry up the root of sin within you? Was it transformative? Well, maybe for some people it was, but for many others it certainly wasn't. And I think it's here that we begin to see the origin or the development of what we call Catholic guilt. This was where it began, perhaps. Well, it didn't begin with this, but it certainly was accentuated by this. And a guilt based on fear. The fear of not receiving forgiveness. The fear, despite the fact that Jesus accepted his own betrayal, forgiveness, but here was now a fear that we would not be forgiven. Quite a big contradiction of the spirit of the gospel when you think about it. And you can't just blame the clergy, because the clergy were caught up in this as well. You had this gave rise to, they were part of it, and priests themselves became highly guilt-ridden and scrupulous. There's many stories about priests who would be terrified that they were not saying the words of consecration rightly, and would keep repeating them because otherwise it wouldn't be valid. So something began to be lost, obviously, from the original. So, through the work of the Holy Spirit, through ecumenism, maybe through interreligious dialogue, and above all through the Second Vatican Council, we began to recover, to restore a truly evangelical understanding of sin as a wound, as something inherent in the human condition, as something dislocated. The word sin literally means missing the mark in Greek. So it's it's an inaccuracy, it's failing, to get it right in that sense. And as soon as we begin to see this as the meaning of sin and the human need for forgiveness and healing, then we begin to look upon our religious identity not so much in terms of survival or of avoiding going to hell, but we begin to see it quite differently in terms of growth, which is actually how the New Testament speaks about it, in terms of expansion of being. May you come to the fullness of life, the fullness of God Himself. St. Peter says, may you share in the very being of God. And it was understood that that humanly we go through the stages of development, and this is growth. This is the meaning of human growth, that we have this invitation, we have all these means given to us to help us, and one of the most beautiful and precious means is the sacrament that we'll celebrate this evening. The growth is our aim, not just getting away with it. So sacraments can be seen as highlighting and celebrating, as we do with a meal, our relationship with God and our capacity to renew that relationship on our side when we feel it has been broken. That was what we would call mortal sin, or when we feel that it has been damaged or weakened, what we would call venial sin. So in other words, we see the meaning of these sacraments in terms of relationship. Maintaining, not only maintaining, but healing and growing these relationships. Just as we were talking yesterday about, different kinds of relationship that go through difficulties. Well, you can often grow as a couple or in friendship by going through these difficult times where the relationship comes under pressure or even where it seems to be broken. These can be ways of strengthening, deepening the relationship. So I think this brings us to this very key question of sacrifice. We talk about the sacrifice in Catholic theology. We talk about the sacrifice of the Mass and the sacrifice of Calvary, of the cross. And the equation here is, I think, completely right. That what happens at the Last Supper this evening is essentially the same mystery that is happening in tomorrow when we relive, replay the crucifixion. The dangerous thing in this, however, is that we see it in terms of violence. Because quite clearly the cross itself is a violent act. And the way this was often interpreted, although there would be many who would claim that the New Testament never speaks about the Passion of Jesus as a sacrifice, that came later, the danger here is that we say, this is the simplest, kind of simplistic, childish, we might say, but at the same time very, very, what should we say, tabloid kind of interpretation of the cross. So, Jesus, God loved the world so much that He sent His only Son to save the world. Why did it need to be saved? It needed to be saved because we were in the condition of original sin. Adam and Eve had committed this huge act of disobedience somewhere way back in the mists of time. This had dislocated our relationship with God and offended God. This is the language then that came to be used. We offended God, and to offend God is a big thing, because you're not just offending your bank manager where you have a slight overdraft, you're actually bankrupt. And by offending God, you incur a debt that nothing can settle, like Greece. Greece will never pay off its debt. So they're trying to have their debt forgiven. But anyway, so this, imagine, put that on a cosmic scale. Humanity is in debt to God, and God is not going to smile at you until you've paid your debt. And the only way you can pay your debt is for God to pay it for you. And so God sends His Son to die this terrible death and go through this terrible suffering on our behalf. And this pleases God. This actually makes God say, okay, I come up with this wonderful solution for this debt recovery. I'll send my own Son, he'll die this terrible death, and we will be reconnected. So, it's kind of a simple equation, but it doesn't match with the spirit of the gospel, or Jesus' own manifestation of God. What we say about Jesus is the Word made flesh. So Jesus is, everything Jesus says and does, as He says, comes from the Father. So, we have to reconsider this. And maybe there is no simple tabloid explanation for this sacrifice. What I think we have to say is that a sacrifice is a gift of self. And it makes sacred, because it is a gift of self, the total gift of one's self. This does not involve sacrifice. This does not involve violence. It is not necessarily a violent sacrifice. Now, on the other hand, we associate sacrifice with violence, either human sacrifice or the sacrifice of animals, which was going on in the temple in Jerusalem while Jesus was there. Okay, gallons of blood flowing down at the time of the sacrifice, and even in a non-bloody way, we might think of sacrifice as giving up something or denying ourselves something or hurting ourselves in some way. Now, this takes us into quite deep levels of the psyche. Even self-harming might be seen as a kind of sacrifice gone wrong. And I would say wherever there is violence associated with sacrifice, it is not real or true sacrifice. Certainly it's not the sacrifice of the cross. Now there is violence because Jesus was actually saying the exact opposite. Because he was saying the exact opposite, that God, as the prophet said, in whose spirit he walked, God, as Hosea says, what I want is mercy, not sacrifice, not bloody sacrifice. So he, by saying that and confronting the religious and the social convention that sacrifice needed to be bloody, you needed to sacrifice all these lambs and whatever you were sacrificing in the temple, or even human sacrifice. Think of the Aztecs or the Mayans. Huge investment in your social organization in the idea of sacrifice. And if you captured thousands of soldiers, you brought them back to Rome and then cut their throats in front of the population, of the Roman population. So, huge investment in sacrifice of blood in order to maintain the social and political and indeed religious structure. This is the status quo. And here you have somebody coming along and saying, no, actually turn the other cheek. And actually, God does not punish you if you do wrong. He will simply accept you and transform you through that loving forgiveness. Well, doesn't that undermine the whole infrastructure and the whole ideology on which really all human society is based? So we might come back to this a little later, but so I think what we need to understand is that the passion of Jesus that we're entering into now is not a sacrifice in the violent sense. There is violence, but the sacrifice involved, which is the gift of Jesus through his acceptance and his non-retaliation to those who are harming him, that is the real meaning of sacrifice. And we can build a whole society, we can build a whole psychology and build a whole religion on a misunderstanding of that. In order perhaps to hide our own need for violence or to justify our own violent reactions to things. Because as soon as we think or allow that God needs violence or uses violence against us, we're totally allowed then to use violence against each other. This justifies human society in its present form. But as soon as we allow ourselves to see through what Jesus is manifesting, that there is no violence in God. What I want is mercy, not sacrifice, violent sacrifice. Then society itself, human culture, as well as the human psyche, is changed. And this is what I think we mean by the redemptive sacrifice of the Mass and of the redemptive sacrifice of Calvary. But we have to see it, engage it, and see it in the right way for it to work. So we'll come back to some of those ideas later. But the crucial thing, I think, is to reflect upon the meaning of sacrifice and to distinguish it between sacrifice from violence, and to reflect upon the context in which Jesus showed us how to deal with betrayal, the root of sin, by acceptance, not by retaliation or punishment, and finally to link what we are celebrating this evening in the Last Supper to what we are venerating tomorrow in the cross.